this is what the young pastor decided he was due, and he arranged to meet one of his parishioners on a Tuesday afternoon, knowing full well that that afternoon this lady would always be there. And so he knocked on her door on the Tuesday afternoon and couldn't get an answer. He was a little bit disturbed, so he knocked again, and he couldn't get an answer. He looked at the windows and saw that the windows were open and realized that she must be in, because if she went out, she always shut her windows. So he knocked again and couldn't get an answer. So he took out his wallet and took out one of his calling cards, and he wrote across it, Revelations 3:20, which I'm sure you all know, don't you? Which is, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice, I will come in to him and sup with him. The following Sunday at church, stood at the back of the church, and the congregation passed by, and he was shaking the hands of all of them. And then up to him came this lady whom he had tried to visit during the week. And she shook his hand and then handed him her calling card, which had on it Genesis 3:10, which you all know, don't you? Which says, I heard the sound of thee in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. Needless to say, that text will not be the subject of my talk. For those of you that have your Bibles, friends, I'm going to read from 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 1. First book of Kings, chapter 19, verse 1. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, So may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, else the journey will be too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. I was talking about timing the other day. My wife and I had decided to visit a friend in London who we hadn't seen for about 2 years. We didn't let them know we was coming. We happened to be in that part of London, so we called seemingly by chance. But my wife very much wanted to see them. And we hadn't been in the house more than a few minutes. Then they shared with us a particular problem that they were having at that moment. One of their 2 daughters, a beautiful girl, had just been married, but she was now in a psychiatric hospital. The problem was that she was having some mental disturbance. She's had a fixation, an obsession that she was going to murder her husband. Now, I know many ladies would like to murder their husbands. But this has got to a state where she actually was afraid that she might at any time get up from bed, go and pick a knife up in the kitchen and go and stab her husband. My wife asked if they would like me to go and have a talk with the girl, and they were only too pleased. Actually, she had just come out of that psychiatric hospital because she was so afraid there, and they hadn't been able to help her. So I went to see her in her home and talked with her a while. She was suffering from a tremendous guilt complex. How wonderful that we had that experience last night, led by Bill. She had many frustrated desires because being her father actually was in charge of a mission church. And so from a very early age, she was expected to be there at every service on the Sunday, as well as most of the services during the week. And she was attending nearly all the meetings too, and taking part in all the activities. She felt guilty if she wasn't at church. She felt guilty if she expressed feelings or thoughts that other young teenagers would have. She was made to feel guilty if she would go to the cinema or things like that. I don't suppose this was meaningly, but it's just that she got a wrong understanding of God. She didn't love God, she feared him. Her parents were gracious enough to recognize that they had in some ways, like most of us parents, made mistakes. So she had these constant expectations of church attendance and the highest expectations of conduct. And 2, as there are in so many little chapels and churches, the narrowest of doctrines, so that people's youngsters' minds sort of are kept in a sort of very narrow limit. And they're not allowed to think. Or when they start to think, they have confusion over what they're learning outside and what they're being told inside church. And so she had suppressed all these feelings and frustrations and guilt. And of course, you can only do that for so long. Eventually, it must come out in one way or another. And with this, it came out just at the time that she was getting married. And she had this fixation, and she couldn't get it out of her head. So anyhow, by talking to her for a little while and explaining to her how that really she had in fact got the wrong understanding of God the Father and the loving Savior, that he was so understanding, so patient with our weaknesses, not demanding us an instant saint, but always dealing with us gently where we are. Also by teaching her how to relax her body and how to relax and quieten her thoughts, and how to see too the effect of her thinking pattern, the continuous negative content instead of a positive attitude. She was very soon restored to health. In a matter of 3 weeks, she was a new girl. She then began to attend drama at her place of employment, which she thought at one time was sinful, and she used to then go to the cinema and do the things a normal girl of her age would do. And she felt such release, such freedom, and came into a new spiritual experience. She has 2 lovely children now and is a very happily married woman. Notice again the timing, how we went there just at the right time. Another night, I had a phone call from a friend of ours, and the phone call said that this friend's son, who was a handsome young man of 24 years of age, again, just married, a school teacher, was in hospital. He had slashed his wrists and didn't want to live. I went to see him at the hospital, assured him that he was going to be healed. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital. His church, again, one of these little chapels that means so well, but again, sometimes so narrow and so fundamental to the point of being dangerous, immediately sent up 2 or 3 friends to pray over him and anoint him, and then took him home with them, believing that he had been healed. Now, I'm a great believer in instantaneous healing. I have seen so many beautiful works of the Lord in this manner, and I really do know God works these great works of love. But it was a foolish thing to do. So when I heard this, I went around to his wife and I said, well, be a bit careful, and should you have any trouble during the night or he shows any signs of tension, just ring the hospital up so that he can be taken in again. And that's exactly what happened next morning. I think, friends, we must be very, very careful how we interfere with some psychiatric hospitals and doctors. At the same time, we know that they don't always have the answer. However, I went to talk to this young man, and a similar pattern had happened in his life. He was a keen Christian. He was in charge of the youth activities, Sunday school work he was doing. He was always round the church, again 2 or 3 times on a Sunday. But again, because of the oppressive nature of the teaching and doctrinal stands, always feeling guilty, to the point too that during his teenage years, every time he looked at a girl, he thought it was wrong. And then his thoughts began to run away with himself, and he began to think it was wrong just to look at girls' clothes in a shop and all that sort of thing. And slowly and surely he was suppressing all feelings, which were quite natural for a young man of his age. And I explained this to him and showed him again how that God again understands that we develop slowly and naturally. He understands that we've got weaknesses. Showed him, introduced him to the God of love and the Saviour, who again is so kind, always with us, ready to help us in time of need. Again introduced him to relaxation of the body and of the thoughts, and to show him too how he had constantly used the thought energy, which is so creative, in a negative way. And then showed him how to use his thought energy positively. He, of course, also was suffering from a sense not only of guilt but of failure, because he was a schoolmaster, and his headmaster had heard about this. And of course he thought this was the finish of his career. After talking to him and showing him how to relax, he came home for a weekend, and then in 2 weeks he came over for another weekend, and in 3 weeks he was out of hospital. Only just before I was coming away, I'd heard he'd been made deputy head of a school. He now has 2 children and in charge of all the computer planning of the school too. But the interesting thing, friends, about both these stories is this, that they were both very keen young Christians. Where was the abundant life that Christ promised to all who follow him? And how many people in our churches are having the same problem? Dare I say it too? How many here tonight are fighting depression and tension? Every camp I've been into, I've had someone come up to me afterwards who said they just about at the end of their tether, and they didn't want to live. Now, it's encouraging in scriptures to see that we have recorded for us a similar story of a breakdown of one of the spiritual giants, Elijah. When I was at Sunday school and all through my young teenage years sitting in church, I used to hear some wonderful stories about Elijah. How I thrilled when they told the story about Elijah challenging the 450 prophets of Baal. How long halt you between 2 opinions, he says to the people. If the Lord be God, serve him. But if Baal be God, serve him. So he calls the 450 prophets of Baal and challenges them to this great duel. Let's set up an altar, he says, and put on it a sacrifice. Let's kill a bull. He says, and we'll both call up to our gods. You call to your God, and I'll call to my God. And the God that answers by fire, he will be God. Right you are, they said. And so they set up the old altars, one after the other. And so the 450 prophets, Elijah says, your first go. They won the toss, you see. Your first go. So they shout and plead, and old Elijah's jeering them on there saying, perhaps he's deaf, can't hear you. Notice me Cockney coming out now. See? So anyhow, nothing happens. And then of course Elijah he says buckets of water, 12 buckets of water he pours over. He wants to make sure of this, you see. So he pours water over and he says, Lord, here we are. And down comes fire, and not only destroys the sacrifice and the stones, but grounds all the stones to dust and then clears those as well and licks up all the water. Marvellous, isn't it? And I remember sitting there as a young boy thinking, God, that's great. I wish I could do that. I don't think I'd have the faith to say that, you know. And I used to think, what a wonderful man of faith. Nowhere in my early years did anybody read to me the story in the next chapter, where this same man started getting frightened of a woman. Now, I know we all get frightened of women sometimes, but not like he did. And he flew for his life. He was frightened of Jezebel. And he was worried about little things. He says, there's no one else in the land except me who worships you, Lord. And he starts worrying about who's going to follow him afterwards. And so all these little worries are getting him into a state. And sure enough, he panics and runs off and throws himself under a tree to die. The thrill of life gone from this great man of God, Elijah. What a lesson for us all. You heard a story this morning from Bill. You half heard a story from Bill because he went through it very quickly. But as he's told his story, I thought of the years of suffering he had. And I'm going to share with you now a little bit of a story of mine too. I was the youngest of 17 children. And you know, after being at Winnipesaukee this week, I'm glad my father didn't stop at 16. I was born as I told you, in the heart of London, in the slum area of London, and my father died when I was 2, and you can see why, can't you? Just in front of our street, we had our area was divided by a very big main road. And this side of the road was all the slums and the tough kids and that sort of thing. The other side of the road was people with a little bit more money than us, and they had some nice houses. And they had a church on that side of the road, and they used to have a little mission hall down on our side of the road. And so they used to send the missionaries over to our side to win the natives. And I was one of the natives. And that's where I learned about Jesus as a young boy and was taken into the Sunday school there and loved it. And then their scheme, and it was a scheme, was as we developed, they would encourage us to come across the road to go to church. And I did. And I joined the choir as a young boy. That was a great help to me because I got paid for the choir, you see, and I got a couple of shillings a quarter. And I got paid for the weddings too, 2 and 6pence, about 20 cents, I suppose. So I used to pray for weddings on Saturdays. And the more the merrier, I said to God. It was a great source of income for our home. But anyhow, during the war, I told you again that my schooling was ruined. I went back to London for the Blitz, and all the time during the war, we had hardly any schooling at all. The schools were taken over by fire service stations, and we had very little schooling, and the teachers used to just keep us occupied, let us play sport. Most of the good teachers were in the forces anyhow, and so we only had a few left, and they used to keep us occupied in the playground playing sport, and so I became quite a good sportsman, but ruined me educational career. However, those early years left a great mark in my life. First of all, being so poor, I began to get a very dangerous anxiety neurosis. I remember even now going into shops to buy food. Now, we didn't have money to buy it during the week, so we used to put it in a book. And I used to go, even at the age of 7, at the end of the week, to try and pay some of that bill, and the bill would perhaps be £4, and I would go and pay £2, and I'd see them carried forward £2, and that used to worry me terrible as a boy of 7, and left its mark on me. And we used to have to go down with suits of my brothers to the pawn shop and get some money to last out for the weekend. However, despite all these things, we used to make a lot of fun, and we used to have a good time in the streets. And so I developed. Later on in life, I joined the Royal Marines and became an instructor of commandos for a couple of years, and then returned back into civilian life. Married and had 2 lovely children. My mother was a cripple by that time, so I was looking after her quite a lot. I was looking after the family in 2 rooms. I had become a young manager in one of the national newspapers of Great Britain, so I had a heavy workload. In the church, I had become very busy indeed. I was youth leader, Sunday school superintendent, on the church council, at the prayer meetings, attending church 3 times a Sunday, singing in the choir, going to choir practice, everything. In addition to that, I was sort of running scout camps too. And then I was also interested in serving Christ, so I was doing a lot of social work. I was so busy doing, and had no time for learning how to be. Again, listening to many doctrinal talks and narrow doctrinal talks, which made me feel very guilty. I used to go in church with a burden on my back and come out with a bigger one. You know what I mean, don't you? So much doctrine, very little teaching on the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, how to be still, how to pray, that we are so blessed with in this camp and in CFO. And what a thrill, youngsters, to think at your ages you've been exposed to some of these great secrets of kingdom living. And it's already beginning to show in your lives. You are privileged indeed. I would rush about. I would try to be in 2 places at one time. Now, you know, when I come to see that God was a God of law and order, it was then not hard to understand that that's silly, that God, who is a God of law and order, wouldn't have one of his children trying to be in 2 places at the same time, would he? And nowadays, when I find that's happening, I say, which one is the one he doesn't want me to be? I used to pray and then go out and answer my own prayers. You do that? And I was so keen to convert people, you know. No one was safe near me who was sitting on a bus. No one. Because you see, I'd had deep evangelical training, and I thought that that was my duty to convert everybody. Now and again, I did convert somebody. But the trouble, it was my conversion, and I had to keep him converted. It wasn't a conversion of God. I felt guilty when I was relaxing. Now, sometimes I would get invited to play a game of football when there was a church meeting or a prayer meeting. And I would mention this to them, and I would be made to feel guilty. Really, what they should have done was encourage me to have a break. So when I was at the church, I wasn't enjoying the service because I wished I was at football. And if I was playing football, I felt guilty that I should be at church. And so I didn't even enjoy either of them. And how so often we Christians get into that state, don't we? My dear mother, as I say, she was crippled. She's a wonderful woman, my mother. Tremendous. Do you know, she used to take me, even at the age of 6, I was out scrubbing offices, 4 o'clock in the morning. Then she used to come home and look after all the children. Then she used to go out and bring children into the world. And then if anybody died in the street, they'd come up to her and she'd wash them out, get the bodies ready for the coffin. She was a wonderful woman. Someone at a camp, about 3 camps ago, said, think of anything that your mother's done that you're still holding a resentment, or you still find hurtful to think about it. Do you know, friends, I couldn't think of one thing. Not one thing. She was marvellous. And so, of course, I was concerned about her when she was crippled with arthritis. And I used to like to spend time with her. And of course, when I was courting, this again presented me with a problem. When I was with my mother, I wished I was out with my girlfriend. And then when I was out with my girlfriend, I thought, really, I should be... Again, this tremendous guilt. Bill, you know, you did such a wonderful thing yesterday. Well, anyhow, with all these pressures, it couldn't last. And another Christian was heading for a breakdown. It happened when my sleep went. Now, it went with a series of night after night nightmares. Now, you may have a nightmare tonight, friends. Don't think you're going to have a breakdown, for goodness sake. They do come now and again. But these were very strong and vivid. They went night after night. And I remember then getting out of bed one morning and realized I'm going to have a breakdown. And I couldn't get the thought out of my head, because when you are in extreme tension, it's very hard to get rid of the thought, the negative thought. And then I was in trouble. I realized I ought to try and relax. And people said relax, but no one said how to relax. And thank God that Anna's shown us this morning on the grass and yesterday morning how to relax our bodies. And people would say, don't worry. But no one said how not to worry, which is a lot different, isn't it? You see? Fear took hold upon me. My prayer went. I could only say God or Father. I couldn't pray. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't read the Bible. I didn't share my problems with anybody. They could see I was ill and see something has happened, but I didn't share. I dropped off one job after another because I couldn't do it. And here again, how silly that is. How necessary these prayer meetings are, that if we got something we're afraid of, bring some of it out. Or find a friend who you can get released by telling them how we're feeling. I'm frightened to death, you should say. Or this is concerning me. But I didn't. Again, keeping a stiff upper lip, keeping it all down, the pressures were building up and up. I struggled on. Went to the doctor. He said, I'll give you some sleeping tablets. And he did. But it didn't give me any sleep. And so I struggled on to the point where I went to work one day and then finally collapsed. Couldn't do anything else. And the director sent me home by car, and I had to tell my wife and 2 children, well, my wife, but the 2 children were growing up, 3 and 5 then, that I couldn't go to work. She didn't understand what had happened, nor did anybody else. And then again, we Christians, we suffer from this. We have a guilty feeling that we let God down. Oh, I've been talking about faith, and now look at the state I'm in. And then, of course, regret. I was a manager at a newspaper. Who's going to give me a job when I go back? Who's going to give responsible work to a person who's collapsed? And the fear that came in. What's the future hold? What about my family? Friends, talk about the woodcutter being in a spot from our first talk. I was just about there at the end of my rope. I went to see a psychiatrist. And I remember that meeting. He said to me, well, he said, after a while, he said, I want you to come back. He gave me some more tablets, and I've been having a lot of tablets, and I rattled so much. And he says, come back in 6 weeks' time. Friends, when you can't sleep a wink right throughout every night, and when you get up in the morning wondering how the dickens you're going to get through the day, and you're in a deep depression, 6 weeks sounds like 6 years. And it seemed like 6 years. Now, Bill said something this morning, and I felt for him. He said that he's been an alcoholic for 8 years, was it? 8 years of suffering. It's tremendous. And 6 weeks seemed to me like 6 years. And I'd already had months of struggling. So after the 6 weeks, and here again we're seeing a great truth that there is a power within each one of us which keeps us going sometimes when we don't want to keep going. The same power that was in Elijah. But after 6 weeks, I struggled through it, and I went to the doctor, the psychiatrist, and I said, you've got to put me in hospital. And so in 2 days, he had me in a psychiatric hospital. And I remember very vividly going in to see the head psychiatrist of the hospital. And it seems a little bit amusing now, but it wasn't then, because I sat down there and he had an interview with me which lasted about 45 minutes. And throughout the interview, he was chain smoking. And I thought to myself, how can he help me? He needs help, doesn't he? It's like going into a barber's for hair restorer and seeing the barber's bald, isn't it? Anyhow, they tried some tablets and they didn't work. And then they decided they would give me that electrical treatment where they put the things on your head and they give you a shock, and I had 6 of those treatments, and the idea is to try and split up your memories so that you don't have the memories of the regrets and the fears. And some people have been absolutely healed by this, and I know them too. So, you know, these people do a wonderful job, the psychiatrists and the doctors and the hospitals. But it didn't do me any good at all. At the end of those 6 treatments, I was still the same. So they would try another treatment, they said. They'd put me into a little room, darkened room, all the curtains drawn, and they put a mattress on the floor so that I shouldn't fall off. And then they gave me semi-narcosis treatment. They drugged me sufficiently to put me to sleep, and then only to rouse me to feed me. And then they would bring and sit on the floor with me and feed me into my mouth because I didn't have the strength to hold the spoon. And after 8 days and nights of sleep, then they thought that perhaps I would get better, but I didn't get better. And I realized then that there was nothing they could really do for me. And so I don't know where I got the courage from, but when you've been in this institution, even for a little while like that, cut away from the world, it takes a tremendous amount of courage to go out, to face the world again. Doesn't it, Bill? So I got onto a bus and went home. And not knowing what to do, and just struggling through every day, I went to work. And they gave me the most menial of jobs, and I can't blame them for it. Just back again to being an office boy. That's a terrible feeling when you've been a manager. And so things were really tough. But then comes again this amazing timing of God and this amazing love that we heard about so beautifully this morning. I had been asked to go to a football match, to see a football match, and strangely enough, I said no because a friend of mine was being inducted as a minister in a church. And I still am amazed that I said no to that request to go to a soccer match. I better put the right words in here. Soccer. So I went on this Saturday afternoon to a church about as big as this hall, and I sat in a row about the third row. My friend was being inducted as a minister. And halfway through the service, I felt a pair of hands put on my shoulders, the hands of Christ. Not the hands of a mystical Jesus, but the hands of a friend who I'd met a long while ago. A young man had come into the church. He had come to live in our area in order that he might experience what it was like to live in the poorer part of London and work in the poorer part of London. And I'd seen him in the church, and I'd said to him, come round for some tea. He was a new face. Now the Bible says, be not careful to entertain strangers, for some have entertained angels unawares. And that's what had happened there, and this friendship had lasted. And this friend, Paddy, a lawyer, he was the lawyer, by the way, that cancelled that lunch that got me into CFO. But he put his hands on my shoulders and says, Bert, I would like you and the family to go for a holiday, and I'll pay for you. So I said, I'm ready for a holiday, Paddy. So he sent us up to Yorkshire to a beautiful conference centre in the north of England. And we stayed there for a week, and I walked the hills, and we played with the children, and we talked to the warden. But you know, friends, still in my mind, although outwardly I may have looked well, and I may have looked happy, inwardly I was suffering murder. And I was just wondering, how the dickens was I going to go back to face that work? Came the last day. Rosie and I had packed our cases, and she was just putting on the children's clothes. And I said, I'll take the cases down and wait for you down there. She said, I'll be down in a moment, Bert. So I went downstairs and put the cases down in the foyer. Beautifully enough, Rosie was for some reason held up. And so I was standing there for something like 7 or 8 minutes. And as I was standing there, wondering where she was, I looked at the book table. Now that book table had been there all the week, but for months I hadn't been able to concentrate. And I looked at the book table, and there, standing right on the edge, was a book, and the title caught my attention. Now let this be an encouragement to those friends who arranged the book table. I praise God for the woman that must have prayed about how she put those books out. Sometimes you never know when you're doing that book table just what effect you're going to have upon the life of the person who buys the books. But the book's title was called Prescription for Anxiety. The title caught my attention, by Dr. Leslie Weatherhead, one of the greatest minds and greatest spiritual men of this century. Because it had that title, I picked the book up, and because Rosie was late, I opened the book, and on the first page I saw that this man, this great mind, had himself had a mental breakdown. And the thought came to me, if he's had one, he knows the way out. And at that moment, what the tablets couldn't do, and what the psychiatrist couldn't do, and what electrical treatment couldn't do, or semi-narcosis couldn't do, God none. In that instant, I knew I was healed. And I took that book home and began to read it on the train, and then began a beautiful healing of the mind and the body and spirit. See again that perfect timing and that perfect placing of a book which God used to heal his children. He never left me. I don't understand, or didn't understand then, why it had taken so long. I knew people were praying, and I'm sure that that prayer kept me going when I didn't think I had anything left. But later on, of course, I saw why and how God had let me go through that experience. He didn't cause it again, as Bill said this morning. But later on, as he also said, he used it. Because, you see, when I went to meet that young girl who had wanted to commit suicide, and the young man who wanted to commit suicide, I could help them because I had sat where they sat. Isn't that interesting? Isn't God good? Doesn't waste a bit once you come back into harmony with him. But then I said, Lord, how come a Christian who loves you so much can get into such a state? I wasn't willing to leave it there. I really was sincere about my faith. I said, will you please teach me some of the secrets in the kingdom of heaven in order that I might live the life abundant? And then some wonderful things began to happen. And if you behave yourselves, I'll tell you tomorrow morning.